Well, good afternoon, brethren. Certainly is glad to see everybody here today. One brief announcement before we start services. I had a couple of messages on my phone. There's tornado watches in St. Louis City, Madison County, St. Clair County. I don't know anything about Monroe or Bond or Macoupin or anything like that that's around here, but you might just keep that in mind and say a quick silent prayer that everybody can make it home safe and that Sabbath is well protected. I'd like to welcome everybody that may be viewing this video at a later date. I'm certainly glad to have you here in Warden with us. It is time to begin services. We're actually a little bit early almost, but maybe we found the right time to start. Maybe that's what it's all about. So anyway, no, it is time to begin services. So I'll ask Mr. Jason McCoy to come forward and give the opening prayer.
Dear great eternal Father, our great Creator, our Sustainer, our Provider, we do come before you, before your great throne. We give you great praise and great thanks for this, your Sabbath day, and the ability to meet together here in peace and in harmony, to be here to worship you. And we thank you for the opportunity to learn from your word today. We ask that your blessing be upon the message that is here. And we ask that you'll be with our hearing, that your truth will be expounded to us, Father. And we do certainly pray now that your hand be upon the weather, that it will pass us by, and that you'll see us home safely, and especially those that are traveling further distances. And certainly, Father, we thank you so very much for the Sabbath day, the time of rest, the time to join with you. And we ask that you will be here for this service, and we turn it over into your hands and do pray this by the great authority of your great Son, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Brethren, if you'll take your hymnals and turn over to page number 73, if you're using the older hymnal, that's page 103 in the newer red hymnal. For our first selection today, we'll sing The Lord Eternal Reigns. Again, that's page number 73 in the older hymnal, 103 in the new. Good beginning, brethren. Turn forward just a few pages to page number 82 if you're using the older hymnal today. It's page number 124 in the newer hymnal, and we'll sing, "Oh, Give Thanks and Praise the Eternal."
Sing to him, sing songs of
our next selection, if you'll turn back to page number 44 if you're using the older hymnal. And that's page number 70 in the newer. When we get there, we'll sing words from the 54th Psalm. It was actually I think David wrote this after the events of 1 Samuel 23 through 26. So anyway, page number 44 in the older hymnal, page number 70 in the newer. You may be seated, brethren. Now to bring us today's sermon is Mr. Steve Buchanan.
Well, greetings, everyone. Glad all of you are able to make it here once again today. It's always great to get together on God's Sabbath day. Greetings to those who may be watching or view this at a later date. I hope that all of you are doing well. I'd like to begin by asking if you turn to Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs chapter 29, we're just going to read one verse. It's a very familiar verse, but I want to begin by focusing on what this says. Proverbs chapter 29, and we'll look at verse 18. It says, "Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint. But happy is he who keeps the law." The Authorized Version, if you have that you're looking at, states that where there is no vision, the people perish. As we understand in the marginal rendering here in my Bible, I'm using the New King James, but for revelation, it has to do with a prophetic vision. Anything that has to do with prophecy that any of us are given has to come from God, or else we're talking about a private interpretation. We're talking about something where if I want to venture out in that area, I'm going to be wrong. That's just the way it is. That's been proven to me time and time again in my day. But this particular verse is very relevant in our lives, that where there is no prophetic vision, if we don't have a goal, and if that goal is not true and real for us, we as a people are going to cast off restraint, as this particular rendering has it in the New King James. We're not going to exercise discipline. We're not going to strive to keep God's law as it was given to us. We're going to compromise. Or if we want to look at it as the Authorized Version has it, it will lead us on a path that will end in perishing. This is something that's very important for us. God grants us a prophetic vision, a goal. Probably each of us, especially just having kept the Passover and days of unleavened bread, have examples in our own lives that actually prove the first half of this verse, where perhaps what we desired our future to be, or better yet, what we prioritized our future to be, what we thought about, what we worked for, what we sacrificed for, took priority. The outcome was not the fullness of joy that God determines that we have. I remember when I was arriving at the age of driving, approaching my 16th birthday, I remember thinking a lot about what car it was I was going to get. That was a goal. That was a priority in my life. And I got a job. And I worked for that goal. At that age, I have to say, that shorter-term goal took priority, and I didn't focus much on what this verse portrays here. There are many other examples that I could give that focus on a shorter-term future as priority compared to what God says our priority should be. Just recently, Debbie and I have been talking about the next several years of our lives as we grow to the point where we near retirement, trying to make plans, trying to think about what the future might hold, what we might want to do. Again, shorter-term goals. It's not that shorter-term goals aren't important and that we shouldn't focus and work towards some of those, but what this verse is talking about is the priority, the overriding priority of this prophetic vision and what we're working for in God's eyes. There is another layer that I want to add to the importance of this verse. If you go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to read just verse 6 at this point. It says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is," must have faith that God is God, and goes on, "and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." As Proverbs 29 said, that those who truly have that prophetic vision and diligently seek God are going to be keeping the law of God in order to prepare for it. This particular verse brings in this aspect of faith, not just believing that God is God, but as it says that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. It's faith not only that God is God, but faith that God is in charge of our lives, and what takes place in our lives has importance when it comes to the end of that prophetic vision for us as individuals. In fulfilling these verses that we have read so far, this pictures, if a person, both sets of those verses, if they're true for any of us, it pictures a person who is growing in character and developing a level of spiritual maturity. It pictures an individual that has probably experienced much, probably asked many questions of God along the way, trying to understand what God's plan may be for them as an individual. But it has a bearing on that level of spiritual maturity that God is developing in each one of us. This character is one that has to be developed from the perspective of an individual relationship with God. It has to be developed from the perspective of a family before God, husband, wife, children. It has to be from the perspective of a congregation as we meet together under God, under Jesus Christ, to again have that prophetic vision, to actually show a faith in God and faith in that all that we experience in this life has a purpose. We know by our own experience that this level of maturity is not given at baptism. When I was baptized, I was very, very naive and young in the faith. There was still much that I had to come to understand, much that God had to bring me face to face with, not just about the surroundings that I found myself in, but face to face with who I am, face to face with what had to change in me. These are qualities that have to be learned through experiences in life. So a true prophetic vision has to come from God, faith in God and in the methods that God chooses to use in our lives. And as we are going to see, there's another layer yet to add to this. If you'll turn to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. We're going to read here beginning with verse 7. The first part of this chapter concerns the beast power, the end of this age. And the beast power allowed by God to affect God's people. Verse 7, it was granted to him to make war with the saints, to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. A very difficult time, the beast power allowed to make an impact on God's people. God's plan, he knows this is what's going to happen. We are given a prophetic vision here of aspects along the way. Verse 8, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, talking of the beast, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. We've seen that phrase before, especially in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. If you have an ear to hear, we need to listen to what's going to be said. Verse 10, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. God is saying the beast power is going to have an impact on the church of God. But he who acts that way will end up being punished in that way. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. The last phrase in verse 10, here is the patience and the faith of the saints. There's going to be things happen to the people of God that the people of God are not going to be able to understand. Why is God allowing this to happen? But it's going to be, again, that character, that spiritual maturity, the prophetic vision we've been given, the faith that is to develop in each of us, that leads to a patience, a patient endurance of what takes place. Again, in fulfilling these verses that we have read so far, a tremendous development of spiritual maturity has to be in place to be able to experience this aspect of this prophetic vision and still diligently seek God. Not compromise with the truth for the sake of a lack of uneasy circumstances, fear of death, fear of pain, the threat, the temptation to take the mark of the beast so that you're going to be able to conduct business, to put food on the table, to have a place to live. A true prophetic vision comes from God. Faith in God is necessary for this. And as we see here, patient endurance while experiencing hard times are three main characteristics that the people of God are going to have to display at this point in their lives. All three of these characteristics are characteristics that God has to develop in each individual. Question that I want to ask is, will we be willing to patiently endure our future to be fully prepared for what is pictured by God's prophetic vision that He's granted us, and faith remaining strong throughout, diligently seeking God, striving with everything we have to obey God? It's so easy for us to talk about this subject as we sit here in peace and safety, even though we have a tornado watch. But when we leave here, we expect to get in our cars and drive to a place of residence to where there's peace and safety, someplace where we're comfortable. But we don't have everything that we're talking about here when it comes to details as this prophetic vision plays out. Title for today's sermon is Patiently Enduring in Faith for the End of Our Prophetic Vision. If you'll turn back to Hebrews chapter 11 once again, when it comes to the subject of faith, Hebrews 11 is the chapter that most people will turn. And what we're going to do is, at this point of the message, we're going to pretty much have a cursory reading of this, but we want to try to keep these three characteristics that we've talked about thus far in mind as we think about the individuals that are listed in this chapter. These individuals tell this particular chapter tells the accounts of real life people facing situations that they may not be able to explain, that they may not understand what it is that God's working out in their lives, but the testimony of their life is written here because of the faith in God and the faith in God's plan that they saw and were willing to sacrifice for. Beginning here in verse 1. This gives the foundation for this chapter. Verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the support for the truth, the support for us willing to not compromise with the truth. It's evidence, it's real for those who have God's Spirit. For those that God gives an understanding to, faith is going to be that support for the truth. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. Verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Again, all of us understand these aspects. But I dare say that we understand degrees of this. Because, as we've talked about so far, what's being developed in us still has further to go. We're still here. If God were finished with us, if we had grown to the level that God wanted from us, He would allow us to go to sleep. But we're still here. There's still things that have to be developed. Verse 4, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. This is an example, if we think it through. Abel was on the earth at that time, as we understand it, when there were just 4 individuals. There's not a world and environment that had developed around Abel. Abel was just there in the midst of his family. It gives the example here of the sacrifice that we're very familiar with. Abel brought a blood sacrifice before God to account for his sins. Cain chose not to. He chose to bring more of a peace or a thanksgiving offering before God. Not, again, from my perspective, not viewing himself as humble before God. But the question that I would have to ask, again, considering these three characteristics, did Abel ever think that God would allow Cain to kill him? Murder is something that had not existed before this time. I don't have the answer for this. These are questions that I ask. Going on, verse 5. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death and was not found, because God had taken him, for before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Enoch is another individual. We don't have a lot of detail of his life, other than that after Methuselah was born, it says 300 years Enoch walked with God. 300 years he had a relationship and was being developed. But we are given little detail as to what Enoch faced. Going on, verse 6. I'm sorry, let's skip 6. Let's go to verse 7. We've already read verse 6. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, you might say a prophetic vision, not the ultimate vision, but a prophetic vision of something that was about to happen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Noah had to continue building this boat, this monstrosity of a boat, from the perspective of those that were around him and mocked him, for a time where rain hadn't happened for a long time. This gigantic boat out in the middle of nothing. But by faith, Noah had to do this, enduring the mocking, enduring everything that took place. And I wonder how many times Noah prayed, I'm doing what you asked me to do. Why am I experiencing all of this? Keep this in mind as we go forward. Verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. As we're going to read a little bit later in the chapter, the people that we're reading about here never received the promise. We've read that verse. We know that that's the case. Here, Abraham was not fighting for a physical promised land. He was fighting for a homeland. Again, that prophetic vision that he looked for, that he worked for, that he wanted for his home. Verse 11, by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him, God, faithful, who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable in the sand which is by the seashore. We have much in Scripture having to do with Abraham and Sarah asking God, why is it taking so long? We don't understand what you're doing. Why can't you just allow Sarah to conceive and let's have the child? But God kept waiting and waiting and waiting for them. Drop down to verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Many times I try to put myself in Abraham's shoes when it came to this situation. I have one son. If God asked me to take him out and sacrifice him, would my faith remain strong? Would I choose to compromise? Would I choose to ask questions, God, why? But we have the example of what Abraham did. Verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Just in that one sentence, so much took place between Isaac and those boys' mother. Choosing favorites, openly declaring favorites. We're not talking here about just problems that God allows to take place in people's lives, but also problems that we as people can create for ourselves. We have all done this. Think of our steps through the church of God. Have we not all, at times, said things, done things, reacted to things that we shouldn't have done? But we started to dig a hole that we're standing in. Each of us have done that. Verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Again, by these words, they didn't see Egypt as their home, as the end of their road. It was again that prophetic vision that God had given them. Verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. And again, cursory reading of these verses, like we talked about on the last day of unleavened bread, does not do justice to the stress of the emotion of Moses' parents here. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, giving up all of what that entailed, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Again, not short-term goals, not short-term profit, but the prophetic vision that God had afforded him. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch him. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. It's so easy for us to read these verses and not feel the emotion, the fear of death, the fear of torture that was in their lives. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. Verse 32, so many more that could be added to this chapter. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. But it doesn't stop there. Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong. This is what God sees. This is the path that he's working on in each of us as individuals. Became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. But there were others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Again, one simple statement, but if we're the ones involved in that statement, will our prayers not say, God, what are you doing? What have I done wrong? Show me what I've done wrong. Help me to see. Verse 36, still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, in mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Again, cursory reading of these verses, we really need to think about what these people experienced, especially as we think about the prophetic vision and the details that still lie in our path. And what God says, still, we may have to face, every single one of us. There are a few verses that I did not read. I want to go back to verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises. They saw the prophetic vision. God granted them that true vision, but they didn't receive it. Abraham was an individual, as I was thinking through this, who sojourned through aspects of the promised land, but never owned 1 acre of it. He didn't even receive that aspect in his life. But it didn't stop him from believing and growing in faith and maturity before God. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Is that a description of you and me? Or are there short-term goals that can take priority? And all of a sudden, what God placed us here for is not what we're the true priority in our lives. Verse 14, for those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. Where they're at is not what they're seeking. It's a sojourning. It's a place where they take residence for that moment, but it's not their home. Verse 15, and truly if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Drop down to verse 39. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, not through doing what you're told to do just because you're told to do it, not doing it because they are given a physical reward, but they do it out of faith, believing in this goal that God has set their path on. All of these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. Verse 40, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. This prophetic vision has all of God's people down through time to receive the fulfillment of that vision together as family, as one before God. God will not give the fulfillment of that until those that live in this age are prepared for it, who develop that faith, who develop through patient endurance, through things that may be unexpected, things that we may ask questions of God, why would you do this? But patient endurance without compromise, diligently seeking God. I want to, at this point, go to a prophetic book. It's been a while since we've touched on aspects of prophecy. I want to go to the book of Habakkuk. This is not necessarily a book that when we talk of prophecy is not necessarily one that we would turn to start off with. Just to give a little introduction when it comes to this book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk, from a verse that we're going to read, verse 6, seems to be written at a time in history just prior to the time that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire conquer Judah and take them captive. From looking at the historical records, that attack on Judah began near 605 BC, right in that ballpark, which places the writing of this book from Habakkuk sometime between 615 and 605 BC. It's interesting to note in my research that there are 3 Old Testament prophets whom we know little of except their name, and Habakkuk is one of those. We don't have a lineage. We have nothing as far as the detail. You might say a lot like some of the characters, the individuals we read in Hebrews chapter 11. We don't have any detail of their lives. Habakkuk is one of those. Obadiah and Malachi are the other 2 that we pretty much just know their name, and that's about all we have. But Habakkuk, along with Zechariah and Haggai, are the only prophets in Scripture who name themselves as a prophet. I'd like to begin in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw." Now, this is an odd way, it seems, to begin a prophecy when it talks about a burden. I'm reading here, again, from the New King James. If you have something like the New International or Revised Standard Version, you're going to see it translated as oracle. This particular Hebrew word is massa, M-A-S-S-A, and it can mean a burden. It can mean to carry away. It can mean a prophecy. It can mean a tribute in song. There's a lot of different variety of meanings for this Hebrew word, but as we're going to see as we go through this particular chapter, I believe the translators translated this as burden because of what they see of the emotions in Habakkuk as it goes forward. Verse 2, "O Lord, how long will I cry and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds." Habakkuk at this point was able to see that life and his experiences in Judah was described here as violence. It was described as contentions, and Habakkuk is praying to God, help us. Cure the problem. Help us to see. This is emotional for Habakkuk. These are his people. He continually prays for that intervention, yet from these words nothing seems to be done. Plundering, violence, strife, contentions all around him. He could not see God intervene. There was no end in sight. As I thought about this and studying through it, could we not pray this same prayer in our day? As we look around us, as we see violence and lies and terrorism and abortions with no end in sight, our prayers to God is for Christ to return, for Christ to establish His government, to teach us the ways of peace. But just like Habakkuk, it doesn't appear there's an end in sight. Even today, God's law seems to be powerless because no one understands it. No one enacts it. Even at times, I wonder about some of the things that have happened within the church. That, why does God allow it to happen this way? We're going to get more involved in that. Verse 5. This is going to be God's response to Habakkuk's first question here in prayer. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe though it were told you. Now, when I read a phrase like that, and somebody tells me something that they tell me, you're not going to believe this, it's not going to be in the way that God intends this statement to be made. He's telling Habakkuk, you're not going to believe what's going to happen. This is not just something that is going to cause awe and amazement. This is going to be emotional for Habakkuk to experience God's answer to his question. I will work a work in your days which you would not believe though it were told you. Verse 6, for indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. This is not just going to be a slap on the wrist. These are people that are godless. They're people that are vicious, that are nasty. They're going to do things that Habakkuk's not going to understand. Verse 8, their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes, and he transgresses, he commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. God is telling Habakkuk, the prayer that you have prayed, the violence that you see among your own people, the violence, the contentions, the troubles. God was already, as Habakkuk was asking that prayer, was already prepared to answer. He was prepared to treat and deal with the nation of Judah. But this is not what Habakkuk was asking for. Not in this way. Verse 12. Habakkuk responds to what God says. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. And he asks this question, why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Habakkuk is saying, God, the God I know, the God I've grown to love, that I have listened to, that I have followed, that I have obeyed, why would you do this? I never thought you would respond like this. Why are you punishing by blessing the godless and causing them to be our captor, blessing them in the violence and the way of life that they profess? I think of Job and the questions that he asked. Father, why do you punish me for something that I can't see that I've done wrong? A lot of time, prophecies, when we focus on prophecies, we focus on when things are going to happen or what things are going to happen. This prophecy is dealing with why things are happening. This is dealing with a situation where God is making a judgment and Habakkuk is trying to understand why. Why this way? Verse 14, why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. This is how he sees the Chaldeans coming in and just ravaging Judah, just like men trying to catch fish. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? Habakkuk does not understand what God is doing. How many times in our lives have we prayed to God in situations that we face because we don't understand what God is doing? If you'll hold your place here and turn back to Isaiah chapter 55, this is a section of Scripture that I thought about at this point. Isaiah chapter 55, hold your place in Habakkuk, now that you've probably already let it go. Isaiah chapter 55, we'll begin reading here with verse 8. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. He could be saying that to me as I think my way through some of the questions that I've had in my life. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways of doing things are different than the ways you would do things. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Verse 10, for as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, and make it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, in the like way, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. In other words, God's judgment, His plan. It shall not return to me void. Or I like the marginal rendering that I have here in this New King James. It will not return to me without fruit. God's judgment, His plan, what He causes us to endure is intended to bear fruit. But it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. God's way of teaching and correcting are not our ways. We would do things differently if it were left up to us. As I think about just in the aspect of correcting, if we would have had the authority by God to pronounce judgment on the Church of God in the 1980s to 90s, what would your judgment have been? Would you not have just moved in, tried to correct the teaching, correct individuals, keep things like they were? Or would we have done what God did and allowed it to divide up like it has? Experiencing what we have. I've also thought many times throughout my life, if it were granted me the authority to heal whoever it was that I came upon, what would I do? Would there be any person who passed in front of me that I would not heal? My heart would go out to them. I would intervene. I would heal. I would ask God for healing. I could not heal. God would have to do it. But if He would grant that authority to use me in that way, that's what I would do. That's the way I would do. Yet God in his wisdom has decided differently. He doesn't work like I would work. He's chosen at this point not to heal every single person now. I believe, again, everyone will be healed, but in God's time. His reasoning, we may not be able to understand, but it still stands as his judgment, not my judgment, not your judgment, his plan, his purpose. And what's the end of that purpose? That it come back to him bearing fruit. That's what he is doing. Habakkuk would never have chosen the Chaldeans to conquer Judah, but God deemed that the best way to accomplish what was needed in Judah. It's at moments like this where our faith, or Habakkuk's faith, in this particular account is tested. When things don't happen like we desire them to, what do we do? Does our faith remain strong? Is it patient endurance that we display, that we grow in? We don't doubt, I don't believe any of us would doubt that God is God. We understand that. But would the faith in God's choices for our lives remain strong? Or would a shorter-term goal take priority to alleviate the pain, to alleviate the threats, to compromise what God has shown us to be his way of life? Would our perspective yield to God's perspective in those moments in our lives? God's work with each of his people is active, even though we are here for Habakkuk may not understand why things happen the way they do. I want to take note of how Habakkuk responded at this time. God has just laid on him the punishment for Judah. And again, as I talked about Job, I believe, it's my opinion, that Job was probably the very first book put, figuratively saying, pen to paper. I believe that Job was the very first book that was actually written. The question that I would ask, did Habakkuk have that information from Job's life that he could think about, that he could act upon, that he could have learned from, whether by writing or by generational lore, parent to child, told the story of in his life? Chapter 2, verse 1. This is his response. I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. That statement is the ultimate in patient endurance in waiting for God. What was Job's response when he was faced with all of those things? Chapter upon chapter of asking God, what are you doing? I don't understand. And growing to a point where even in attitude, he began to wane in being diligent in faith before God and in the methods that God chooses to use. Here, again, did Habakkuk have all of that he could think about? Perhaps. But he chose to wait. Wait on God. He trusted and displayed faith, not only that God was God, but he had faith that what God was allowing had purpose for him. And he said, I'm not going to speak. I'm not going to respond until God corrects me, where he alters my perspective to understand. Verse 2. Perhaps before I say that, he was going to continue to keep God's law as he understood it. in all of the situations, as I look at my life, in all of the situations, has this been my response? And the answer is no. There are still things I have to learn. There are still ways I have to spiritually mature in my life. Was God surprised that I had problems? I don't think so, because he's patient with all of us to help us grow in character, in maturity, to understand this way of life before him. But it's important to focus on our response because of what these next few verses say. Verse 2, then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. Now, as we have thought about the Chaldeans coming in, ravaging Judah, we can read this last phrase, that he may run who reads it, as if you flee danger. That's not what this means. If you would think about what Paul said later in his writings, that we are to run the race that is before us, that is the meaning of this word here. So this vision that's written on tablets, the one who reads it, that individual will run. That individual will not compromise. That individual will not wane in faith in God and wane in what God chooses to allow. That he may run who reads it, for the vision that you're writing down is yet for an appointed time. Habakkuk was going to experience a type of this in his lifetime. But what God's describing is for a future time. The vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Through all of those trying times, through all of those unexpected events, perhaps in times where they're on their knees in tears and in prayer, asking God, why are you allowing things to happen like this? The race that we are to run is to be holding true to what God's taught us as far as the way we live our life. The faith in God, the faith that what God is allowing has purpose for us as individuals, and eventually for the entirety of the family of God. God told Habakkuk to write this down for the future. We have focused thus far on these three characteristics. We can look at our lives and see how God has developed those three characteristics in others that we see around us, aspects where we can even see some of those in ourselves. The prophetic vision that we have been given has taken much longer to happen than we thought. For those who go back many, many years, we thought 1972, we're out of here. It's taken much longer than we thought. But even though that it's taken longer, have we chosen to patiently endure? Have we chosen for that faith to remain strong when unexpected things happen to us? We can look around us today and see the same things that Habakkuk saw among his own people. No end in sight, but only a sinking further in the hole that we as a country or we as mankind dig for ourselves. Will we allow God, as Habakkuk did, to correct our perspective if it's not right? Will we wait on God to build a stronger and deeper faith in us for Him and His purpose? And will we watch and wait patiently for God to fulfill the promises that has been given to us as our prophetic vision? The writings of Habakkuk, I feel, made a strong impression on the Apostle Paul. If you'll turn to Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13. In a message that Paul was giving here, we're going to break into the thought, just read 2 verses, beginning with verse 40. It says, "Beware therefore," Paul talking to Israelites and Gentiles in his day, "Beware therefore lest what has been spoken in the prophets come upon you. Behold, you despisers, marvel and perish. For I work a work in your days, a work that which you will by no means believe, though one were to declare it to you." Paul understood that what Habakkuk was talking about, he translated to his day as Paul believed that he was living in the last days. Just like we translate it forward for us as we believe we are living in the last days. The warning is for us, and we have to heed it. Please turn to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. We'll begin reading here with verse 35. Again, Paul talking to those in his day. "Therefore, do not," verse 35, "therefore, do not cast away your confidence." Don't throw your faith away. Don't allow it to wane, "which has great reward if you hold on to it, if you allow it to grow. For you have need of endurance," or a patient endurance. Paul could see in them that it still needed more developing in them. "For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise," that prophetic vision. Verse 37, "For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come, and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith." Exactly what Habakkuk said. But Paul goes on, "But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." That is God's perspective. We are not to discard, no matter what happens, no matter what God allows to happen, the unexpected, perhaps the torture, the pain, the threat of death for us, those who are close to us, that the faith remains strong in God and in God's plan, God's law that we hold true to. As God did with Habakkuk, as he did with Job, as he did with those individuals listed in Hebrews 11, God will test our faith in ways we will not expect, perhaps ways that we would never believe the God we know would test us with. If that happens, what will our response be? If we are written about in Hebrews 11, what will the testimony of our life proclaim? Will it be a faith that doesn't waver, or will it be something that we cast aside? God makes clear that his people will live by faith in him and in the methods that he chooses to allow. Those who draw back and not respond by faith to continue to keep his law without compromise, God will not be pleased with. There is no growth of faith and spiritual maturity. So we begin to conclude, go back to the book of Habakkuk. We're not going to go through the entirety of the book. If you'd like, we stopped at chapter 2, verse 4. If you'd like to go through, read the rest of chapter 2. It talks of warnings that are given. Chapter 3, many people speculate that Habakkuk was a Levite and that Habakkuk was someone who was gifted when it came to writing song, because they look at chapter 3 as if it were a psalm. It actually reflects the prayer of Habakkuk. For the sake of time, we're just going to go to verse 17 of chapter 3. This is Habakkuk's conclusion as he has finished singing this song of praise before God. Habakkuk says this, and we have to ask ourselves, will this be our response? Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet. Habakkuk is not saying, my feet now are like deer's feet. He's saying, I believe God will make my feet like deer's feet, and he believes that he will make me walk on my high hills. Of all the emotion that Habakkuk expressed, everything that came from God that he certainly didn't intend with his prayers, he didn't believe that the God that he knew would respond with, this still lives as a testimony to the faith and the patient endurance of the prophet Habakkuk. Having that prophetic vision and goal is necessary, or we will cast off restraint. We will compromise, and ultimately we will perish. But on top of that, without faith in God and what he allows in our life, it will be impossible to please him. It will be impossible to progress and to grow as God intends we do, so that that fruit that God desires will return to him. These statements are more than just sweet-sounding religious words which we use in our conversations one to another, that we just use on the seventh day of the week or on holy days. This is a way of life. They represent real life for God's people as we are trained to be fully functioning members of the family of God. Today, perhaps, we are dealing with family issues, sicknesses, financial problems, spiritual trials and tests with no obvious end in sight. How do we respond in our thoughts, in our prayers, with our words, in our actions? Is what is expressed the faith that God is looking for, the patient endurance that he asks us to be grounded in? As I look around at God's people that I know of, as I look around the room here, I see a spiritual maturity that has developed. And the examples that I see helps me. But I don't say that to say the race is finished by any means. I appreciate what God has done for us as individuals. I appreciate the love, the mercy that he extends, the patient endurance that God shows, waiting for that fruit to be born in us. And as I look at my life, I see so many times where God's had to be patient with me and had to wait, waiting for that fruit to come forth out of me. None of us are done with being trained by God in ways such as what we have thought about today, what Habakkuk experienced, what the people of God are going to experience at the end of this age. God has a plan that is yet to be carried out. The question that all of us have to ask and that we don't have the answer for yet, will our lives be a testimony of that type of faith that we have read about in some of the individuals in Scripture today? will we wait for him and watch to see how God chooses to further teach us while keeping the priority fixed on that ultimate prophetic vision as priority that God has granted each of us to see. As time progresses, and so much more violence and trouble around us, it's up to us to patiently endure, to strive, to diligently seek God and His attributes, His character, and try to mirror it. That's our goal. For a final scripture, if you'll turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39. And all these, having attained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. The prophetic vision, one family, however hard it is to believe, this gigantic block of people who love each other, who want the best for each other, who don't think of themselves, but are one under God. That's what I want to experience. That should be the ultimate priority in our lives. What story is going to be written for each of us? That's up to us.
Brethren, there will be some local announcements after the closing prayer, so if you'll just remain in your seats, we'll get that taken care of in, I'm sure, short order. It is time for the last hymn of the day, so if you will pick up your songbooks and please stand, turn over to page number 4. If you're using the older hymnal today, page number 25, and the newer. Our final hymn is "Give Ear Unto My Words, O Lord." And after this hymn, I'd like to call on Mr. Stephen Boucher to come forward for the closing prayer.
For
Mr. Boucher.
Almighty God in heaven, we thank you very much for calling us to have our eyes opened and to have faith. We appreciate that you build upon it, and we certainly don't always understand the times that we go through. We constantly ask that question, why, but we appreciate having examples that we can go to and learn and to grow in faith, knowing that despite our not having the vision that you do, you will get us there. Please help us to continue in that faith to, as the song said, encompass us about as a shield. We appreciate that we can always know that you are there. Thank you very much, and please continue to take care of us through this week as we leave services here into another week. We thank you and pray through the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.